DevOps thought leader, is an expert on DevSecOps, Agile, and analytics. He currently leads the DevSecOps Transformation team at Contrast Security. He has constantly been striving to create the highest performing software engineering teams. Today, he joins us to talk about a simple, step by step framework for a full DevSecOps cultural transformation for development teams. It explains how to build trust and address the mindset shift concerns for all audiences. Let's join hands to welcome onto our screens Mr. Larry Maccherone.
My name is Larry Maccherone. I'm here to talk to you about a systematic approach to cultural transformation for development teams. I'm starting off with a little bit of a provocative message here. The beatings will continue until morale improves. Now, if you're feeling a little uncomfortable at the moment, that was my intention. This is a phrase from an old Navy captain who basically thought that he could get morale to improve by beating his people. It doesn't work that way. And I'm using this as an analogy because a lot of times the way we go about trying to do application security and DevOps transformation feels like we're beating up the development team. And they really know what they want to do. And it's our jobs to really work with them, to enable them, to empower them, to help them to accomplish what they want to accomplish and in terms of DevOps adoption. And so I'm here to talk to you about a way to do that. A little bit about my background. I'm not going to go through all of this here right now. I have a deep engineering background. My first startup was a process controls business where we were controlling 60% of the world's power grid. So if the bad guys got a hold of us, our software, found a vulnerability in our software, they could literally bring down the world's power grid. So I developed sort of the capability to produce defect-free, vulnerability-free software in a very DevOps fashion 20 years too early. So now I'm actually at Contrast Security, where I'm helping teams get and organizations adopt DevSecOps practices. And I have a side project called Transformation Blueprint, transformation.dev blueprint. And that side project is essentially the coaching framework that I'm going to talk to you about here today that helps teams to adopt DevOps and DevSecOps. The credibility I have comes from my experience at Comcast. Comcast is an international conglomerate, multimedia conglomerate. Universal Studios, a lot of properties that you may not even be aware of are owned by Comcast. And they have 600 development teams. I brought those 600 development teams from an old way of doing software development and application security up to a very modern DevOps and DevSecOps way of doing it over the course of 5 years. And the framework I'm going to talk to you about today is essentially the framework I developed there. One last thing to note about me before we move on is that I'm an active developer. I write code every day. I'm the primary author of a dozen open source projects, one of which gets 1 million downloads a month. So not a trivial, just for fun project, very much used in production by a lot of teams. And the reason I bring that up and I point that out is because I'm not just preaching. I'm not just saying, do it this way as an industry expert or as a consultant. I'm actually practicing it. When I form a new team for a new project, I stand them up the way I'm about to describe here. So the first thing I want to talk about is mindset. Mindset is sort of the key factor in accomplishing this. Sometimes you don't necessarily go directly at the mindset, but a few things you do have to sort of go directly at the mindset. And the first one of those is that policy enforcement and cajoling and gatekeeping are not going to work, especially on the security side of things. And you really need to have a coaching approach to them. And here's some of the reasons why cajoling and gatekeeping and policy enforcement don't work. You must do X. It's a great way of stating sort of the expectation. That's fine. But if that's where you stop, or if you just go to the point of just requiring it by auditing it and reporting on it, that's not enough. That isn't going to help them actually accomplish it. First of all, you can't keep up with the pace of development. It's changing so rapidly. If you insist on it a certain way, it'll change by the time you get there. It's not fun work for either the people on the giving end, the people doing the auditing, the gatekeeping, or the people on the receiving end. It's confrontational, which also doesn't lead to the relationship you need. Often you get just a checkbox response. Yeah, we have Jenkins. It's over there. I'm not sure what we use it for, but we have it. It says we're supposed to have it. We got it. We meet the checkbox. And that's not what you want. You want the team to actually be using Jenkins to provide them with speed and quality improvements. And so you really need to focus on those cultural things more than the actual sort of physical thing that they can checkbox to. They're rarely context sensitive and often out of date with modern practices, and complete enforcement can seem arbitrary. But if you do a full audit, then it's too much information. Gosh, you gave me 50 things to fix. I don't know where to start. I'm just going to give up, throw up my hands. Often we think we can achieve the desired behavior change if only we can create more relevant consumer policies, or get better at enforcing these, or implement metrics-based incentives, or train our developers better, or collaborate better with engineering via an engineering champion program or a security champion program. All these things are good, but what's really missing is a systematic approach to getting folks to actually adopt the practices that you're trying to get them to adopt. And so that's really sort of where I come in. Interesting note here about the security side of it, DevSecOps. There's a concept of DevSecOps where the security is supposed to be built in theory, but the way that tool vendors are implementing it, they're really bolting on DevOps to their traditional security pig, and it doesn't work. And so I really like this definition for developer-centric application security, DevSecOps. It's empowered engineering teams taking ownership of the security of their software while using flow, feedback, and learning, also known as the 3 ways of DevOps, to continuously improve software value delivery. So this is Gene Kim. I call him the godfather of the DevOps movement. I know he didn't sort of invent it. It wasn't the only person sort of launched it, but he's the one that I got most of my guidance from when I think about DevOps. And there's a few quotes there and the 3 ways there. These are sort of the meat and the heart of what I have built my program around. And we're going to reference those a little bit later. So the first thing you need to do is identify and prioritize the practices that you want development teams to actually adopt. So you can borrow practices from industry standards, but if you do that without transforming them and prioritizing them, that's a recipe for frustration and false starts. Here's a few sources for that. They don't always say the same thing. They target security specialists in the case of security standards. They fail to specify adaptations needed for a dev-first approach. There's too many practices. They're often overwhelming, and they're not prioritized. And they fail to consider the team's unique context. So instead, what I recommend you do is you host a workshop. Bring together the experts on DevOps or security and the engineering leads, the people who are doing the engineering work, together into a room. Bring the DevOps team or the security team into the room with the 3 to 5 most respected engineers in the organization. And the reason I say that is that often you get the leader set, and the leader is sort of more of a business person at this point, and is often out of touch with what's going on, often has influence from an executive perspective, but doesn't have that sort of cultural influence of, hey, that person is really doing great stuff. I want to do great stuff like them. And that's going to be the most respected engineers in your organization. So it's really key you have these most respected engineers help you build this program, because if you don't, they won't advocate for it. They'll be like, oh, well, that was done by some experts over there, and you can ignore that. And you don't want that. That would essentially sabotage your whole effort. So you need them right from the start, helping you to build the program, helping you to prioritize the practices. you collaborate. At first, everybody puts up their own framework. These are the practices you want. We want ephemeral CI, container-based CI used by every team. We want an automated test suite that tests 85% of the functionality, has test coverage of 85% across every development team, et cetera. And you basically have them, each person work individually and make their own little list. And the experts will make their list, the security experts or the DevOps experts, and then the engineers will make their lists. And then you merge them. And in the course of merging them, moving Post-it notes around on a board or the electronic equivalent, you get some really interesting conversations. And these conversations are really sort of the key to pulling this off. Often what's going on is that the experts are saying one thing and it means something to them, and the development engineering leads I think it means something different to them, or vice versa. And so they're talking past each other a lot of times, where they're going, yeah, we're in adamant agreement, when they're really not, because they have different definitions of the terms. And my job as a facilitator of this workshop is to sort of notice when there's subtle differences in wording and highlight that to mean that there's bigger differences in meaning underneath it. And the whole idea is you're trying to create an easy button for each development team to self-adopt these practices. You don't necessarily do it for them. You make it easy for them to do it themselves. And then you coach teams with this list of practices. And I'm going to talk about coaching here next, actually. So the idea of coaching in my framework, in my program, is really key. And in fact, it's the key idea in my framework here. And I use this progression of maturity. It's my maturity model, if you will. It's a bit different than what you used to for a maturity model, though, because most maturity models are a list of practices. And you have level one, if you're doing it or not doing it, there's a list of practices. You have to be doing all of them to get to level two. And there's level three, and then level four. And it's binary. You're doing it or you're not doing it. For me, I don't actually provide the list. I want you to come up with your own list. So it is context sensitive. And I want you to use industry lists. Yeah, I don't want you to ignore that. But I want you to come up with your own list. And once you come up with that own list, then I want you to coach each individual development team along this maturity model for each individual practice. At first, we don't know if the team is doing this practice. That's unknown. That's that blue color down here. Then it's at thoughts, meaning they haven't put much thought into it. Maybe the day you talk to them, the first coaching session is the first time they've heard about it. Words means, okay, well, now we're talking about it. And now we're actually making plans to adopt it. Actions means we partially adopt it. Maybe we've got it for 3 of our 5 apps. But partial adoption doesn't mean you've done one half of the whole app worth. That's not partial adoption. It has to actually providing value, just not complete value, but it has to actually providing value. And if you're only halfway there, done the sort of grunt easy stuff up front, but you're not actually getting any results from that, that's not actions. And then culture is you wouldn't think about doing it any other way. Now there are situations where a particular practice doesn't apply. This is an older app. We're not actively developing it. We can't put a pipeline around it. So let's just forget about that. And that's smart. And that's the right decision. But for every place where you could be doing this practice, you are doing it. So thoughts, words, actions, culture, THWACK is the acronym for that. So at the end of this, you'll have been thwacked. And the way you use this is you sit down with each individual development team. And when I say individual development team, I mean the 5 to 25 people max, usually 15 people max, development team. It's called a 2 pizza team sometimes because you can feed them with 2 pizzas. You can't feed a 25 person team with 2 pizzas or even a 15 person one. But the phrase still holds. You don't want to say, okay, we've got a 100 person development team all working on one product. No, it doesn't work that when you do that. You actually need the smaller sprint size team, the squad maybe is what you call it. And you do a partial gap analysis. And I say partial because you're using this list you created in the first workshop, and you're talking about each practice very deeply and in the order that they were prioritized. So with the first workshop, you don't just come up with this list of practices. You actually weight each practice. You say, this is 25% of the value comes from doing this, and 15% of the value comes from doing the second one, and 7% of the value comes from doing this third one. And so you have it prioritized and relatively weighted. And you start with the most heavily weighted ones, talking about them. And you want to talk the most about those most heavily weighted ones, of course. And so you spend all of your time sort of talking about it until the team knows what you're talking about. They get it. And they start to think, well, for us to do this, we would have to change this, and we would have to buy this, and we would have to get permission for this. You get them into planning mode. You get their heads not just saying, yeah, I understand what you're saying. You get them into sort of really internalizing it. And what would we have to do to actually adopt this practice? As soon as you have 1 to 3 practices that feel like they would be willing to adopt, you stop the gap analysis. Maybe there's 20 practices in your list of practices. Forget about the other 17 maybe, or it's usually you get through 5 to 10 in the initial workshop that you talk about at least. And ask the team to pick 1 to 3. They're going to turn 1 shade of green darker on this scale in the next 90 days. And that's the way you work with the team. And they commit to that. And then you coach them over the next 90 days. And then you come back 90 days later and you help them pick a new list of 1 to 3. Over the course of about a year and a half, you can take any team from very low levels of software engineering maturity to very high levels of DevOps maturity. And it works for any team when you take this approach. And some folks sort of complain about this as it not scaling, but it really does scale, because think about it. These workshops are only 90 minutes long for the first one and 60 minutes for each follow-on one. So call that an hour and a quarter on average. So 1.25 hours per workshop. Let's say you can do 10 of these workshops a week. That's 12 and a half hours of coaching in workshops per week. Now that you need time to set them up and to sort of do ad hoc coaching. But that still leaves 20 plus hours to do that stuff the rest of the week. Okay, so that's per week. How many weeks can you do this for? Well, it's a 90-day cycle. So, in 90 days, it's really like 13 weeks. But let's say there's vacation, a few. Let's just call it 10. And so 10 per week times 10 weeks in a 90-day period equals 100 teams. One coach can coach upwards of 100 development teams. And so it scales very, very nicely. You probably have more people than this doing other DevOps work. You just need to reallocate some of them to this coaching work in order to get this to happen. When you do this, you get 1/6 as many vulnerabilities in production. I measured vulnerabilities when I was at Comcast. I suspect you also get 1/6 as many defects in production as well when you do this. And it takes 1/4 as many resources from the DevOps team or the DevSecOps team or the application security team. And so it's a 24x ROI. And if you gather the metrics yourself, you can prove this to your management and you can convince them to move forward with down this path. So I've packaged this framework up in a piece of open source software. We've got it in alpha testing with one client right now. I'm getting ready to launch the beta for it. It's called transformation.dev blueprint. I mentioned it earlier as my side project. You can go to transformation.dev and you can sign up for the beta when it's available, and then you'll get this framework and you'll be able to sort of use it to facilitate your coaching. So coaching is key, but you need a few other things. You need toolsmithing. And I'm going to go fast through the rest of these because it's only a half-hour talk. But you'll get the slides and you'll be able to sort of come back and review them. One of the key concepts that I really focus on with DevOps transformations and DevSecOps transformations is that you really need to center everything around the right spot in the workflow for the developer. And the right spot for most feedback, quality feedback, failing automated functional test is not later in the process when it gets to QA. It's right as the pull request is being evaluated. So developer creates a pull request. The pull request kicks off a pipeline run. The pipeline run runs all the automated testing, all the automated security testing, all the automated functional testing, all of the automated testing. And if anything fails, it's going to report that back. And the developer is going to be like, oh no, something was wrong with the code I just wrote. I better fix it. And the developer immediately responds to that. And so they're in the right mode of operating, and it works really well if you put all the feedback right there in the pull request. And the reason for that is psychological, developer psychology. Is they're passionate about that code they wrote this morning. They want nothing more than their peers to say it's wonderful. And if it's got a red X mark on it from an automated test, they're going to, not want that to not want their peers to see that. So it's pride in their work that keeps them that motivates them to actually do this. And they'll jump through a lot of hoops, including doing some micro learning in order to make it happen. Days later, they have already moved on to a new heartthrob, and the code they wrote that morning is not really, all that exciting to them. Okay, so optimize for learning is the next idea. And the point here I want to make is that often we get into this find and fix mode with automated testing or even auditing, like, you're not doing these practices. The key here is to basically think of every defect or every vulnerability or every incident as a learning opportunity. First, fix what caused the incident, of course, and that's 1X. But don't stop there. Find and fix others like it that maybe haven't caused you a problem yet, maybe haven't been noticed or detected by an automated testing tool yet, but they're enough like the last one that you should fix them before they cause you a problem. And then put in place some change that prevents you from ever having this, which is often a check at the pull request level, but sometimes it's just training. Basically, the learning from the bad experience will prevent that from happening again. Metrics are also important. Again, I don't have a lot of time to go into metrics. I could do a whole talk on metrics here, but this is a cumulative flow diagram that I use to motivate teams to improvement. The top line goes up when new defects or vulnerabilities are found. The green line goes up when they're resolved, and then the blue line goes up when the team marks them as risk accepted or false positives. And you can use all three of these lines to sort of diagnose the health of the team. Now, some folks just talk about sort of defects fixed or vulnerabilities fixed as a metric, and that's this green line here, and it's going up. And so you would think this team was doing well if you just looked at that. But if you have all three lines, you can actually see they're not doing well. The top line is going up much more rapidly. The green line is going up. And the only reason the green line sort of caught up with the orange line here is that we had we marched a bunch of things as risk accepted, will not fix. And that's this cliff here that gets represented in this cliff here. So that's not really a healthy pattern. That's a team that's scrambling, that's trying to sort of move things off of their plate. They're not keeping up. This is a better pattern. The team started with automated testing here. They added some more. And then they really ramped up their fixing of the vulnerabilities or the defects from that. And then the interesting thing that happened is this line at the top really leveled off. And, they're not adding new defects. They've learned from all this fixing how not to add defects or vulnerabilities. And they rarely mark things as false positives or risk accepted. They had this little spike right here. That was actually the testing was broken in this case. And when they fixed that testing, they were able to mark a bunch of other things that were false positives essentially as resolved. And that's what this cliff here actually came from. So cumulative flow diagram. This is a macro view of the thoughts, words, actions, culture maturity. These are the same shades of green. And the more green, the better. And this is for 10 teams, though. And so this is a visualization you use to coach a business unit leader, for instance. And then this is this trend over time. And you can see sort of how the organization is doing. They're doing great on this practice, not so great on this practice. And the list of practices is not important. Remember, you can come up with your own list. Whatever your list is the list that this chart will render in transformation.dev blueprint. I actually did a study correlating the adoption of this approach to performance, vulnerabilities found in production, which are vulnerabilities or defects. So I consider it an aspect of quality. And this is where that 1/6 metric comes from. The teams that adopted this approach had 1/6 as many defects / vulnerabilities in production as the teams who did not. So that's my content for you here today. If you have questions, please connect with me on LinkedIn and send me those questions. And if you'd like to reach out and pilot a program, that's also great. Or if you want to hit transformation.dev, you can sign up for a beta of the software that will guide you through this practice. Thank you very much.